Hi, I'm Amanda Stanley, the Executive Director of Caucus, and we're honored to be sponsoring this special session on our changing climate and the need for changing strategies. I'm joining you from my hometown of Seattle, on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, and I honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. I'd like to offer my special thanks and appreciation to Chair Castor and Congresswoman Bonamici, two visionary leaders who are committed to both identifying and solving problems. And my thanks to our esteemed panel for sharing their thoughts and insights with us today. We've had the pleasure of collaborating with many of you over the years. And a huge shout out to Chris Sari and our team at the National Marine Sanctuaries Foundation for pulling together this important annual event in a virtual format in such challenging times. The Sanctuary Foundation and Caucus share an important milestone this year. We're both 20 years old. The landscape, or should I say the seascape, has changed dramatically over the last 2 decades. And one of the biggest changes is the increased importance and value on science and data in decision making. There's still a lot of room for improvement, of course, but we like to think that a key factor has been our 2 decades of training, coaching, and connecting scientists to extend their impact beyond the lab and field. This year also represents an important pivotal point for Caucus as we examine how we best can serve our community of scientists and our ever-growing network of researchers, journalists, decision makers, and community leaders, including many of you joining this conversation here today. Increasingly, we're seeing that the challenges of biodiversity loss and climate change demand solutions that are equitable, just, and inclusive. And we look forward to hearing from our panel on these subjects today. To help meet these challenges, Caucus is investing ever more deeply in building a purposeful, intentional network of scientists who can lift up solutions that promote the well-being of people and nature. We invite you to join us on this journey and to actively engage in creating a future where people and nature thrive together. Thank you so much for joining us today, and to our panel and to our moderator, Charlotte Hudson. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Congresswoman Castor from Florida and chair of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Saving our oceans and protecting our aquatic ecosystems and preserving coastal industries are central to solving our climate crisis. The oceans have been bearing the brunt of climate change by absorbing heat and carbon pollution, causing temperatures to rise and water to become more acidic. That has led to habitat disruption and fueled more extreme weather. I understand what's at stake if we do not listen to scientists and take action now. That's why I'm grateful to the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation for holding its Capitol Hill Ocean Week virtually this year. We've all been doing our part to combat the coronavirus, but we also must keep fighting for climate action and moving to 100% clean energy. Protecting our oceans and coasts are more important than ever. Reducing carbon pollution and developing natural climate solutions can help us preserve the planet's marine biodiversity and protect communities from sea level rise. This in turn will help our blue economy and benefit countless American workers whose jobs are tied to the fishing and tourism industries. Now, since we took the majority, House Democrats have shown our commitment to preserving our oceans and coastlines. Last year, we passed legislation I authored with my colleague, Congressman Francis Rooney, to permanently ban oil drilling off the coast of Florida. We also passed the Coastal and Great Lakes Communities Enhancement Act to boost our coastal resilience and invest in natural infrastructure, so the communities are better prepared for the impacts of climate change. Now the question we're hoping to answer today is, how can we protect the ocean through conservation planning? And how can regional leaders help fight the climate crisis? It's an important conversation, and I'm grateful to all of you and to today's panelists for this conversation. Thanks, keep up the good work.
Happy Capitol Hill Oceans Week. I'm Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici from Northwest Oregon, and along with my colleague, Congressman Don Young from Alaska, we co-chair the House Oceans Caucus. We work with more than 80 of our colleagues on policies that protect the health of our ocean. I want to thank the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation for convening this important virtual conversation in these challenging times. And at this time, we cannot lose sight of other threats to our world, and that includes the climate crisis. I serve on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, as well as on the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. I am committed to relying on science and making ocean-centric solutions a priority during our economic recovery. That includes net zero emissions no later than mid-century. Last year, after the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate, I led my colleagues in calling for an ocean climate action plan. That would include policies like my bipartisan Blue Carbon for Our Planet Act, to restore and conserve our coastal ecosystems and recognize their value as an effective climate mitigation tool by sequestering carbon dioxide. And my bipartisan bill with Congressman Young to strengthen investments in marine energy research, development, and demonstration, because we need to recognize the untapped potential of the waves, tides, and currents as a clean energy source. In addition to ocean-driven mitigation, we also need to adapt. We need to adapt to the current effects of the climate crisis. Last year, the House passed my Coast Research Act to expand scientific research and monitoring of ocean and coastal acidification. And now I'm working on a bill to expand research, monitoring, and mitigation for harmful algal blooms and hypoxia. And because of your research, education, and outreach efforts, there is bipartisan interest in advancing ocean climate action. I look forward to our continued work together to advance policies that protect our ocean and our planet, especially now during our ongoing recovery efforts. Thank you all.
So good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Charlotte Hudson, and I direct the Lenfest Ocean Program, which is a scientific grant-making program based at the Pew Charitable Trusts. Our goal is to support research that addresses the needs of marine and coastal stakeholders, and then help our grantees engage with the people most likely to use the research results. If you're interested in some of the projects currently supported or to learn more about the Lenfest Ocean Program, please visit our virtual booth on the CHOW website, or visit us, of course, at our website at lenfestocean.org. I was excited to moderate this panel because within the Lenfest Ocean Program, one of our grant-making portfolios focuses exclusively on how the changing climate is impacting our oceans and coasts. As we all know, climate change is profoundly affecting marine and Great Lakes biodiversity and challenging us to adapt our strategies for conservation planning. As we think about it, everyone involved in ocean and freshwater management needs to climate-proof their work, meaning we should ask ourselves how the changing climate may impact the questions we ask in our scientific research, alter the type or location of habitats that we seek to sustain, because they may look one way today and very different in 20 years. And the changing climate may bolster or upset ocean and coastal economies, causing uncertainty and disruption. Chris Sari and Ben Charo have assembled an excellent panel for our discussion today. And before I introduce them, I want to let you know a little bit about our session. In the first half, each panelist will have a few minutes to present their perspective on how to address climate impacts in conservation planning. Then I will turn it over to the panelists and moderate a discussion around a few of the topics raised. Although I will not be able to ask the panelists questions directly posed by you, please type any questions into the chat box, which looks like a little cartoon bubble on the top right of your screen. And then panelists will be able to address your questions in writing. And if you're a person inclined to tweet, please use the hashtags CHOW2020 or virtual CHOW. In today's conversations, our panelists will touch on the two sides of addressing climate change. How we mitigate the impacts of climate change will be touched on from the perspective of how nature can be harnessed to increase resilience and store carbon, particularly as an economic value. Panelists will also discuss adaptation strategies, which involve how individuals and communities will need to adjust their relationships to freshwater and marine environments. So first, I'm going to hand it over to our first speaker, Frank Ettawageshik, is Executive Director of the United Tribes of Michigan, which is an organization committed to advance, protect, preserve, and enhance the mutual interests, treaty rights, sovereignty, and cultural way of life of the sovereign tribes of Michigan throughout the next 7 generations. Internationally, Frank has represented the National Congress of American Indians at several meetings of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So Frank, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. It's really great to be able to present to everybody in this way, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's in the Great Lakes. We have had many different efforts to try to work to preserve the waters of the Great Lakes. The countries of Canada and the United States have worked together. The various states have worked together with each other in the provinces, and the tribes and First Nations, Canadian First Nations and U.S. tribes have worked in joint efforts for many years. Working on, there's a consent decree that concluded the negotiations for the 1836 treaty, in which we were working as tribes in Michigan to preserve our rights to the inherent and treaty reserved rights in that treaty to fish and hunt and use the resources. And the water plays a key role in all of the things that we do. We have a Tribal and First Nations Great Lakes Water Accord that we work together with about 185 tribes and First Nations in the Great Lakes Basin. And the work that we did with the Great Lakes Collaboration that started under President Bush, as there was a cabinet level task force that was to help work on issues for the Great Lakes. And then there was a collaboration under that, and we did a plan for the preservation and restoration of the Great Lakes. Tribal people were very much a part of that development of that plan and that process. Today that's led to funds that we're all working together to protect the lakes. Now, the other things that go on is that internationally, we have worked on the issues of climate change. We know that these are extremely, for indigenous people. Our problem is that as the climate changes, we are now fixed politically, geopolitically. We can't move like we have under previous climate changes throughout history. We're fixed, and so the climate change is going to sweep over us. And so that means that we have to work to adapt to the changes. At the same time, we're working to mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions, and to try to work to help keep as many changes as possible, as small as possible. But this is like the work that indigenous people do internationally, is working to help protect and preserve our sacred duties that we have. And we feel that it's more than just work for us. It's actually it's a way of life. And it's important that we maintain those relationships with all of the beings that we share this great creation with. And those things are such a different people from all over the earth, the indigenous people in the Caucus that we gather with for the climate change meetings. Water still is a very important part of all of that. And the oceans and waters are so interconnected. But it's real easy for some people to forget the freshwater, we get forgotten often, and we have to really work hard to make sure that people are aware of it, the issues that those of us who live on these Great Lakes, on this freshwater. So we're looking at one of the things that we think about, and what's important for us, is our spirituality and that relationship to those sacred duties. And I went outside one day here a while back, and I looked at the lodge that we have here in our yard. When I looked at it, there was a rainbow, a double rainbow, but it was an orange rainbow that was coming right out of the top of the lodge, it looked like. And that is sort of indicative of the kind of feelings that we get when we think about how we're protecting our water and protecting the environment. And so with that, that's just a brief overview of some of the thoughts that we wanted to share. And so with that, thank you very much.
Frank, thank you. I'm now pleased to turn it over to Eric Schwaab. Eric is the Senior Vice President for Oceans at the Environmental Defense Fund, where he leads global work to advance sustainable fisheries management and ocean health, with particular emphasis on climate resilient fisheries. Eric previously held and led the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Fisheries Service during a period of significant U.S. fisheries reform. So Eric, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Charlotte, and hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be with you today to talk about new ocean strategies for a changing climate. And building on the presentation by Frank, I want to focus, in brief, a few comments that are fisheries focused. You know, climate is already changing ocean conditions in ways that are affecting ocean habitat, fish distribution, and productivities. Some additional change is inevitable. Some we can avoid through better control of greenhouse gas emissions. Globally, because of the changes already felt, fish are moving. They're moving to deeper and cooler waters. This is altering the productivity and location of fish stocks around the world. It's stressing not only the fish, but it is stressing our management systems. Habitats also are facing the shock of warmer waters and other disturbances. You know, here in the US, we've made incredible gains in the last decade or so in rebuilding depleted stocks, in ending overfishing, and we've built a model of sustainability, working for both fish and fishermen. That system is already at risk as species like black sea bass and fluke on the East Coast, and Gulf of Alaska, Pacific cod, shift ranges and face recruitment impacts. I just want to share with you a slide or two to illustrate that this is a situation that we are seeing around the world. This is the slide from Gaines et al. That shows the number of species expected to enter and exit new jurisdictional waters by 2100 under various climate scenarios. Fishery management systems built to manage stocks within defined jurisdictions are already facing challenges. If we do not take steps now to adjust the scope of our management, our successes that we've realized in the US and abroad will be undermined. This second slide illustrates that effects will be different within different climatic zones. In the tropics, biomass and productivities will generally decline, putting communities in those regions at greater stress. In the polar regions, we will see increased fish biomass. And in the temperate parts of the globe, movements in and out will create much more dynamic species distributions and productivities. At EDF, we are working to support fishery management systems that can better respond to changing ocean conditions. Our core premise is that instead of managing for today with one eye to the future, we need to squarely adjust to what's coming down the road to develop new management systems and new tools and new relationships today so that we can manage these changing distributions and productivities into the future. This third slide just provides for you a few quick examples of climate resilient fishery principles that we think are inherent in these deliberations going forward. Under modest climate scenarios, we can avoid the most dramatic impacts of fishery production if we ensure management systems that are capable of adjusting for both fish and fishermen. I'd love to talk a little bit more about some of the examples that we have underway, and perhaps we can do that in Q&A. But just take for granted that we have to deal with this issue And if you're interested in more details, both in our discussion and beyond, I would recommend you go to resilientseas.org for examples, for the principles, and for backup documentation around the few comments I've just shared. Thank you.
Eric, thank you. And I would encourage you all, please do take notes during this so that we can return to some of these questions as our discussion entails. So now I would like to hand it over to Dr. Sara Maxwell, who's an assistant professor at the University of Washington, Bothell. Sara's research focuses on the development of science-based solutions to sustainability issues in the ocean, specifically on the application of spatial tools, such as satellite tracking and movement modeling, to understand the distribution of large marine predators. So Sara, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, and thank you all for inviting me to be here. I'm going to focus a little bit on some of the tools that we can use to mitigate some of the impacts of climate change. And my focus is on the ocean, and so my apologies for not discussing the Great Lakes explicitly, but they certainly are inherently part of this. So much of my research has been focused on the effectiveness of marine protected areas. And you can see by looking at a map like this, we have a lot of protected areas on our planet, though perhaps not as many as we have targeted. We have about 8% marine and 15% on land. And in particular, a lot of my research has focused on how effective marine protected areas are, particularly for large mobile marine species, such as some of the ones you see here in this image. And what I do is often use things like satellite tracking to understand how animal movements line up with the boundaries of protected areas. Part of the problem with both of those images of protected areas and of animal movements is that they're static, when in reality, the ocean is a highly dynamic environment that's changing rapidly in space and time, as are the animals that are using these environments. And these changes are only being magnified under climate change. How could we draw a box, for example, around Laysan albatrosses moving over scales like this? Now try to imagine drawing a box around even a small portion of the movements of northern elephant seals that you can see in green here. It would be such a large portion of the ocean that honestly this would be politically unfeasible. Of course, we can protect parts of their range using static marine protected areas or other measures, but really what we need are more flexible management approaches that can incorporate their movements as they flow through what is really a dynamic ocean. And so applying this dynamic view to spatial management of the oceans is what we call dynamic ocean management. This means management that changes in space and time in response to the shifting nature of the ocean and its users based on some sort of new data, whether that be the integration of new biological, oceanographic, social, or economic data. And that we do this in near real time, so on the order of days to a few months. So dynamic management is already being used. So one example is this Turtle Watch program. This is a voluntary program run by NOAA out of Hawaii's, out of the Pacific Islands Fisheries Science Center in Hawaii. And it's used for the shallow set longline fishery to reduce the bycatch of sea turtles. Based on the sea turtle temperature preferences, approximately every week, NOAA releases a map of areas where fishermen should avoid in order to reduce bycatch of sea turtles. And bycatch of sea turtles has previously shut down this fishery as they're a highly protected species. Similarly, in the California swordfish fishery, myself and my colleagues developed a tool called EcoCast. And this models the habitat of a number of species and highlights areas that are the best and the worst to fish on a daily basis. The outputs of these models are available on the web and then through an interactive website that both fishermen and managers can use, and this is hosted by NOAA. As we continue to face climate change, the concept of dynamic ocean management, and particularly mobile marine protected areas, become even more critical. We really need these innovative and dynamic tools to help protect species and habitats as these things are changing in ways and in timescales that are unprecedented. Mobile marine protected areas would function similarly to MPAs as we know them, but their boundaries would shift in space and time as animals or oceanographic habitats change. And we need this kind of management in order to buffer and mitigate some of the impacts of climate change as the boundaries that currently exist may no longer be appropriate as we move forward. And with that, I would like to say thank you.
Thank you, Sara. And lastly, I would like to introduce Ralph Chami. He is the Assistant Director of the Institute for Capacity Development at the International Monetary Fund, where he oversees the development and implementation of the internal economics training program for all IMF economists. His recent work has focused on trying to put a value to nature that financial systems recognize. So Ralph, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. So I guess I'm the economist among this group. This is wonderful to be here. So let me talk about an ocean view that's gone from an ocean view that focused on the ocean as a victim of acidification, climate change, to what I would like to think of as ocean as a champion that in the fight against climate change. And really the pivotal moment came in COP25, where after all, the oceans are the lungs of the planet. They absorb tremendous amounts of carbon dioxide, and in return, they give us every other breath that we take, that is oxygen. So this benefit of the ocean and knowledge of the ocean as absorbing all that carbon dioxide and providing life, contributing to the provision of life to all of us, has resided in the world of science. That knowledge has always been there. Question is, at the same time, we've been trying to get policy action to protect the oceans, and we've been trying to get financial help in terms of to shore up the mitigation efforts. So how do we do so? You have all that benefits that's residing in the world of science, whereas you have policymakers and financial sector that speak a different language, the language of cost-benefit analysis. So what we really need to do, we need a translation of the scientific benefits that we already knew about into a language that policymakers and financial experts can get their heads around. So in the work that I've done is by valuing the benefits of the ocean and the ecosystems in the ocean, by valuing them, you move them from the world of science into the world of dollars and cents. And that way you can get the policymakers and the financial markets to start to understand the benefits in the language that they understand, and then they can do what they do best, which is cost-benefit analysis. Once you have that, then you can start to think about how we can put policies around the oceans to protect them, and bring in the financial sector into this and provide sustainability to our mitigation and conservation efforts. An example of this is the first paper that we published was the whale, because the whale plays an important role in the carbon capture and carbon sequestration. So you look at the whale, you look at the services that the whale provides, and then you value it. And once you value it, then you're taking all that science that we know about what the whales do, and now you're translating it into the language that financial people understand very well. Question is, once you have that, it's still a number on a piece of paper, 2 million, whatever the value of the whale is. Question, it remains on paper. In order for it to actually become viable, actionable, we need policy. Okay, we need governance. And where policy comes in is in terms of once you show that the asset, once you show that this ecosystem has services that are beneficial to all of us, then policy comes in to provide protection to this asset, provides rights to this asset. And by providing rights to this asset, it also enforces in terms of monitoring and in terms of penalties if harms were to be inflicted on these assets. So policy is needed. Now, once you have the legal rights and protection policy confers on these assets, and you have the valuation, then we can start to talk about bringing the public and the private in a partnership into a viable ocean economy that is built on the value of life. By doing so, then you're talking about an ocean that goes from being thought of as a depletable resource to an ocean that is thought of as a renewable resource, okay, that provides employment opportunities to local communities, provides benefits to the country, provides benefit spillovers actually to the rest of the world. And by doing all of that, you're really now talking about an ocean economy that's contributing to economic growth in a sustainable, inclusive, and nature-friendly way. So that's what I would like to talk about today. And thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. And I think you have teed up, of course, all of our panelists have teed up a number of things that I think we can build off as we continue to discuss some of the things you've raised. You know, Ralph and Frank, I think maybe this may seem unnatural to others, but I actually see a lot of similarities in some of the things you both have been talking about. And from whether it's the way the indigenous communities think about conscious capitalism or how the IMF values nature, you know, from your different perspectives, you both serve as translators between scientists and, in some cases, valuation or finance sectors. I'm wondering if you could each speak a little bit more about some of the conversations you've been having and how those conversations you think are trying to move the ball towards building in how we think about climate change and biodiversity in that sense into these natural environments.
Sure. In terms of ever since we've written that paper about the whales, people have come, you know, I've been asking, so what's next? I think it's very important to understand that the valuation of the natural systems is incredibly important for this conversation, but that valuation has to be credible, has to be relevant, and has to be communicated. I see what we've done is basically just translating the science into the world of public policy, because the two camps were speaking different languages. The public policy space, the financial space in which I've lived in for 21 years at the IMF, understands very well cost-benefit analysis. So when you talk about mitigation and adaptation, they understand very well there's a cost to all these things. But then the next question you get asked is, so what's the benefit? You want me to incur monitoring costs. You want me to protect the ocean. But what do I get in return? Typically, the scientists would answer in their language, which is you get biodiversity, you get but you've lost the conversation. In 2 minutes, you've lost the conversation because the person sitting across from you, the person with the dollars, the person with the budget, it just understands dollars versus dollars, euros versus euros, whatever currency you want to have. So you can think of what we've done. I'm not a scientist. I've accessed the science and brought those benefits were understood in the science into language that is understood by the policymakers and by the financial people, saying, look, now when you ask me what is the benefit, it's Y dollars. The cost is X dollars. Is Y greater than X or is Y less than X? You can do the cost benefit analysis yourself. But that is not enough. As Frank was saying, you need the governance part. The governance part is very important for this part. And that's why you need the policy around this once you've made the valuation argument, right? If you believe there's an asset and that asset has value to us, then we need to protect it. We can't just talk about it. Okay, we need to effectively protect it. And once the financial markets understand that there's protection, there's legal protection, then you see them starting to take this conversation more seriously. And then they would come into this because they also would benefit from this. Then you're really creating markets around this whole effort. And then you're really talking about the markets about living organisms, not an ocean. I'm just talking about the oceans here, but we can apply it, for freshwater also, where you think, right now we think of the oceans as a depletable resource. You take the fish out, and the fish only has value when it's dead on your plate and you're being charged a certain amount in a restaurant. Same thing for countries that still eat whale meat. What we want to do is say no. By having them alive and well in the ocean, the value far exceeds that of dead ecosystems. I'll stop here.
I think about this, that when my ancestors were working on treaties and we were part of the treaties here in the Great Lakes, we reserved fishing rights. And they didn't look at the water and say, those are our fish. Rather, they reserved the right to fish. And when they did that, what they were reserving is the right to sing for the fish, to dance for the fish, to pray for the fish, to catch and eat the fish, to live with the fish, but to have a relationship with the fish. So the treaty reserved rights are actually relationship rights. So that's true with our medicines and all the different things. But in particular here, I'm going to talk about fish because in the water. And that relationship has to be thought of in this system that Ralph has just talked about. It isn't just a matter of the value being a value of dollars and cents, but there's also this other value that we have to figure it out. And this is where the conscious capitalism comes in. We have to figure out something that may be monetarily profitable and maybe wise. In the long run, when you think of relationship with the natural world, it isn't as wise as it appeared to be in the first place. And so you want to be respectful of all of those different beings, and as we respect them, they respect us. This is sort of the same thing that we were just talking, but this is approaching this idea that Ralph's talking about as an economist. I'm talking about it as a tribal elder, tribal spiritual leader, governmental leader. These are the things that we pay attention to. And there is a way that all these things come together. There's a place where we all meet. And I think it's important for mankind, for humankind. It's important for us to find that place and to make our policies around the idea that this place exists, where all of these things can come together. And we can live, we're trying to find harmony here on Mother Earth. And sometimes that's a little bit easier said than done, but I that's really our goal, is to walk softly on Mother Earth and to respect all life.
Thank you, and thank you both. And I think, I think this panel is already a success, because when we have an individual from the IMF and an individual representing indigenous communities coming together in the first question with like minds, I think we're moving in the right direction. But on that note, I'm actually going to turn it over to Eric for a minute, because Eric, you spoke mostly about climate resilience, but I know that you're also looking at ocean-based mitigation opportunities. So just building on Dr. Chami's comments, can you offer a few thoughts about how oceans can be part of the climate solution?
Yes, absolutely, Charlotte. Thank you. And I couldn't agree more with Dr. Chami's point about the oceans as being part of the solution, not just victims. His whale example is very compelling and important. I think it's also important that we talk about coastal habitats. Mangroves, salt marshes, seagrasses present triple win opportunities for coastal communities. You do have opportunities, and salt marshes, mangroves, seagrasses, very efficient at capturing and storing atmospheric carbon, but they also provide for resilience for coastal communities. during storm events, and an inordinate amount of habitat for early life stages of many important species, both commercially as well as in ways that contribute to our biodiversity. So we've really got to look at these coastal triple win opportunities as well. Thank you.
That's great, thank you. And you know, I think thinking about these ocean and coastal opportunities, you know, one thing that I keep hearing over and over again, of course, is the impacts of shifting populations. And I know, talking to Frank earlier, I personally, from where I sit, have always been thinking about this, of course, in the marine environment, and then, of course, building in the freshwater environment. But I believe actually it also applies, of course, to the terrestrial environment. And so really this question, I really wanted to hear from Eric, Sara, and Frank about really the impact of species migrations, because it seems to be that whether it's commercial fisheries swimming into new management jurisdictions, or the indigenous community's relationship to the sugar maple tree, which I recently learned about, you know, this is a topic that is, I think, now part of the conversation. It's not, is it happening? It's now, what are we going to, how are we going to adapt? And so I'd love to hear, frankly, perspectives from the three of you about how the climate has impacted these conversations and frankly, either changed or you've adjusted your work and relationship. And anybody can, maybe Sara, why don't you go first?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think it's really interesting that things have changed as much as they have, but yet so many of these changes are really difficult to anticipate. And I think personally, that's one of the things that's the most exciting to me about dynamic management, whether that be terrestrial or ocean, and you know, mobile protected areas in any way, is that if you have the understanding of animals in or we'll use animals, it could be a habitat, it could be variable, but if you have an understanding of, let's say, animals on a short time scale, if you are managing based on those short time scales, you'll automatically encompass that larger time scale shift and that larger spatial shift that we're already starting to see. And the thing about that shift is that it might not be linear. It might not be, okay, now this species is moved further north. It might be moves north and back south and north and back south. And so if you know enough about the biology of the species that you're following, or even if it's something related to human users, if you're trying to somehow use that for something like fisheries or shipping, something along those lines, if you know enough about the biology or the users that you're trying to protect, you can follow those small shifts over time, which is not as challenging as it may seem. And I'll kind of hold on to that thought for perhaps a future part of our discussion.
Yes, we'll definitely come back to the how challenging it is, dynamic ocean management. We'll definitely get back there. But Frank or Eric?
Charlotte, I'd make a couple of points. First of all, it starts with science. It starts with understanding the nature of the changes and as real time as possible. You know, in the humble current regions of Chile and Peru, we're working with scientists and managers to design and implement an early detection system for changing ocean conditions. And the real purpose behind that is to give both scientists and managers and ultimately fishermen the opportunity to adjust to changing distributions and make quota adjustments accordingly. You know, I would also say that one of our challenges in the fishery management system is a lot of our allocations are based on historical catch patterns, and those historical patterns are now mismatched from where the fish are or will be. And so we've got to look at management systems that move beyond just simply historical based allocations. And there are some good experiments that are out there that involve everything from formula driven reallocations that are based on, to some degree, historical catches and to some degree, current distributions. But we also think that rights-based approaches where you have tradable quota options might be also a big part of the solution forward to avoid interjurisdictional conflict and allow these management systems to succeed under these changing distributions and productivities. Thanks.
With part of the converting some of this thinking out, looking at policy. When we were negotiating once again on the treaty, we were working. The Treaty of 1836 was only about 10 years ago that we finished the negotiations on a portion of that were outlining the use of certain portions of the inland areas. And as we were doing that, of course, there's inland waters, but there's also Great Lakes waters. And what we were looking at is the idea that we couldn't be too species specific in our negotiations. Because if we were very species specific, we realized that with the changing climate, those species may move and we were going to be fixed. We couldn't move with them. And so we wanted to preserve the right to fish for the fish that were here, whatever they are. And so we know that different populations are changing. Some of the streams where we used to fish for trout, for instance, are warming up due to bulk groundwater withdrawals around the streams and other places, and the trout are really not comfortable living in that water as it warms up. And so we have a lot of issues like this, but the policies that we set for our tribal governments, our indigenous governments here, have to be adaptable to the changing climate and the changing economics of what's going on, whether we're commercial fishing or charter boat fishing or guiding on the rivers, doing, as fishermen. There's all these different things that we have to adapt and learn how to preserve those rights to do differently. So it's an application of understanding the changing, the migration of the species that we've come to rely on and how they may be moving to other areas. That's been an important part of our understanding the relationship with all these parts of the natural world.
Thank you. And Frank, I mentioned the sugar maple. I think it's the sugar maple, and I wonder if that example of how really a community resource that's habitat is changing is emblematic. Not just, obviously we're very focused on fish, and of course I love fish, and we're all fish all the time. But I wonder if telling that story actually might, in brief, might actually be a little bit emblematic as something people can visualize, frankly, on land, since it is so hard to see what's happening in the water.
Well, sure. That for us, the sugar maple, Ninatig, our tree, it's so important to us that that's the name of it in our language. And we have, forever, we've been working with the sap from this tree to make maple syrup and maple sugar. And that's been, it's our source of sugar. And it's been a critical part for us. There's a lot of stories about this. And what's happening is with the climate that's changing, the natural habitat of the sugar maple, within a few decades, that's no longer going to be where I live. Even though we're right smack dab in the middle of it right now, that the territory for that tree is moving north and following the climate. And so what's that going to mean for our people to adjust to our tree no longer being with us? There's a whole issue of how do we deal with that, and it's not just that tree, because we also have to adapt to bringing it back to fish. For instance, there are certain species of fish that are the symbols in the clans, and when those clan leaders are no longer with us, What does that mean for us? You know, how do we adapt to those things? How do we deal with that? So there's not only the economic side of this, but there's also a spiritual, cultural side of dealing with the change. And I think that Maple Tree, thanks for asking that question. That's a prime example. But there's a lot of other examples that deal with medicine plants and with various food and plants, and also various items that we use for in our traditional economies. Thank you.
And I think, Frank, that that actually was a great way to tee up, you know, what Sara alluded to, and I'm going to pick back up now, which is, you know, you've highlighted some of the biggest challenges that we necessarily can't get around in terms of as species move, and Sara's work, I know, focuses on, well, if we know where the species are, hopefully we can, you know, provide management systems that that can conserve some of these areas. And Sara, you alluded to, you know, how hard is this, or is it, you know, can we really do this in practice? And you mentioned the turtle example, and frankly, some of the examples off the West Coast. But could you speak a little bit to, you know, the questions I always hear around enforcement of dynamic ocean management, and particularly mobile MPAs? You know, could you speak to some of the, you know, experiences you've had and seen how this type of management has worked?
Yeah, so I mean, enforcement is the question that always rises to the surface. I should note that there is, as far as I'm aware, there is no example of a mobile MPA that's currently enacted. But my feeling is that the issues of enforcement around that would be similar to what they are for a static protected area, with the exception that you would just have to be aware of where those boundaries are. And also it would require potentially some additional communication to users. What that communication looks like, I think is we can reference dynamic ocean management examples of that. And in my experience, there are, I would say, at minimum a dozen examples of dynamic management that currently exist. There are only a handful of those that are compulsory, so they're mandatory applications. There's one off the coast of Australia. To some degree, the example I mentioned about the California swordfish fishery is in some ways compulsory. I won't get into details on that. But the majority of the ones that exist are actually voluntary. And I think that actually is a really important point, in that the thing about dynamic management is that while the management structure might feel a bit more complex, if you're able to have management measures that move and shift in time, theoretically that area can be smaller. If you are trying to protect, for example, blue whale habitat over the course of an entire year or even an entire season, you might need a really large area because you don't know exactly where in that area it's likely to be. Whereas if you can, let's use an example of a right whale, since they're auditory and we know of examples of this. If, for example, you know where right whales are based on their calls, and you have a system of acoustic buoys out, you can close smaller areas for less time than you can if you were trying to basically buffer that area because of your lack of knowledge over and to basically allow for you to be sure you capture that, since you can't change that boundary. You're going to make it bigger. And so really I think is particularly exciting about dynamic management, and at least the concept of mobile MPAs, is that it reduces the amount of management that's actually necessary. So in my experience working on the California swordfish fishery, fishermen were really, really enthusiastic about this concept because they were facing a really large closure for, in that case, it was leatherback sea turtles that was enacted for the majority of the fishing season. It was a huge area, like the size of California, whereas dynamic management potentially could make that area and the time that's off limits much smaller. So I think that while enforcement is always an issue, there's a high incentive for users to be in favor of dynamic management, and therefore potentially just the need for enforcement, because compliance is likely to be higher, may exist in that framework.
Right, thank you. That's actually really helpful, and I think this area is an area, at least from where I see, that really continues to evolve and advance. And so I think the future really is bright. While it seems complex, I think the future is bright there. And unfortunately, I think we are nearing the end of our time. And so I actually want to start, I want to end where we started, actually, with Ralph and Frank. And unusually, again, you both have mentioned in different ways, really a little bit of the legal impacts, or kind of the legal regimes that may impact how these new strategies under, to deal with climate change impact your different areas of work. And Ralph, for you, I think it was kind of the legal rights being bestowed on nature. Frank, I think if I remember correctly, it really was the multiple treaties that are in place between First Nations, tribes, Canada, and the US, and how those rights negotiations and frankly legal instruments either help protect biodiversity, or frankly, it'd be interesting to hear may provide challenges along the way. So it'd be great just to briefly hear from both of you about kind of those different legal aspects, and then we will pull to a close.
So in terms of the importance, as actually everybody's been saying, Eric and Sara and Frank, the importance of having this legal framework around nature is very important. I know, for example, that in New Zealand they've conferred personhood on rivers. Now, once you do that, that means once you confer personhood on something, it has rights. And as a result, we have obligations towards that biosystem, if you like. See, then I'm a financial economist, from that perspective, that's a game changer as far as I'm concerned. I know there's a big initiative right now in Chile called the Blue Boat Initiative, which now involves the government of Chile with philanthropies and the sciences, trying to actually take that concept and look and protect their whole ocean and everything that lives in it. Okay, so the legal side, and as Eric mentioned, the governance side is incredibly important, because otherwise everything that we're doing in terms of the valuation remains just basically valuations. And there's so much that you can say about self-governance, in the sense that, well, this is a very protected area, you shouldn't do this. But we know very well that once the government comes down, the legal side, and says there's a legal right to the ecosystem here, and it's enshrined in the law, and there are penalties to incurring damage or causing damage to this, then this is a game changer. Because then you see markets coming in, you'll see insurance coming in, trying to insure against such losses. You start to talk from my language, which is the language of financial markets. But I want to leave you with this before I go. There's a very nice book that I'm not going to advertise it here, but talks about that up until Descartes came around, in the Middle Ages, there used to be courts against animals. Animals used to be taken to court with their owners, because humans had a very interesting relationship with animals. They used to view animals as intelligent beings. So there are court cases against, whether you like pigs, donkeys, what have you, okay? And sometimes they would actually dress them up in human clothes to the extent, and they would be tried in the court of law, okay? So all of that was alive and well. Imagine it up until the 1700s, up until the Descartes, the industrial movement, which basically divorced humans from the nature that they existed in, and allowed us, yes, to move forward with technology, but allowed us to move in technology away from our roots, which we are part of this nature. So what I'm trying to do in this framework is say, no, we can have it. We can think of an economic paradigm that also takes nature and as a partner in all of this. therefore, then you can talk about sustainability. Exactly what Frank is saying, living in harmony, but in a sort of in a modern, if you like, under a modern concept of sort of economics, modern economics.
Yes. Perfect. And Frank, very briefly, I just wanted to give you a quick moment.
Well, I wanted to need to tell you about my friend Henry Lickers, who is the first Indigenous citizen to be a member of the International Joint Commission between Canada and the U.S. on boundary waters. And Henry tells this story that is really important in this case, because he talks about how the province of Ontario had discovered that their box turtles were disappearing rapidly, and there were hardly any around, and there were just a few pockets of them. And they developed protocols to try to help preserve the box turtles. And they came to the tribes and wanted them to join in with them to help protect the box turtles. So at the meeting, Henry said, well, why don't you humor me? On this map up here, put up where all the box turtles live. Now I want you to put where all the reserves are. And then they noticed that the box turtles were living on the reserves. And at the reserves, they said, we pray for them, we sing for them, we sometimes eat them. Well, we live with them. They're our relations. And as we take care of them, they take care of us and they thrive. So you're coming to us and wanting us to adopt your protocols. You've killed off all your turtles. Now you want us to adopt your protocols and kill off the rest of them. No, you need to adopt our protocols because we're living with them and we're working with them. And I think it's that concept that I've heard Ralph and everybody here talk about is it's important for us to live with and to, this is an example of that. And as we talk about the rights of nature and all these things, that part of that right is for human beings to live with these creatures, not just giving them rights. And so that there's a part of that right is a responsibility that we help take care of each other. We feed each other. The rivers help provide us water to drink. And so it's important that we have these relationships living together. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and thank you.
Absolutely. And Frank, thank you. I think that's actually a great conclusion and way to kind of wrap up our discussion today. And so I want to thank all of you, Sara, Frank, Ralph, and Eric, for your comments today and for your willingness to go along with my discussion. And I believe this discussion actually tees us up for future conversations, perhaps at the virtual happy hour, which I encourage everybody to attend tonight at 5. I believe it's BYOB. Also remember to visit the virtual booths and the other resources that are on the Capitol Hill Oceans Week website. I think there's a lot of resources there that this discussion can help contribute to and will further. So again, thank you all for joining us and submitting your questions through the chat box. And thank you.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.